The first thing Kale noticed when he woke was the cold. Not the cold of space. He knew that cold, had trained in vacuum suits on Titan's shadow side, until the chill seeped through 3 layers of thermofiber and lodged somewhere between his sternum and his spine. This was something else. Stone cold, ancient cold, the kind that had been sitting in a concrete wall for years and would still be there long after he was gone. He was lying on his back on a narrow cot, bolted to the wall. Above him, raw gray ceiling with a rectangular hole cut through the center. Below him, visible through an identical hole in the floor, another gray ceiling, another hole, all the way down until it became too dark to see. A shaft. He was in a shaft. The other cot held a man who was already awake, watching him with eyes that had done a lot of calculating. "You're new," the man said. His name, he would later offer, was Dressen. He'd been in the stratum. That was what he called it, the stratum, for 2 years and 4 months. He said this the way a man states a prison sentence, with the flat affect of someone who has long since moved past the grief of it into something more sustainable. Practicality, maybe. Or just the absence of surprise. Kale sat up and took stock of himself. Human male, 31 years old, formerly Specialist Second Class with the Consolidated Reach Survey Corps. He'd brought a book with him. The guards, such as they were, a bored voice through an intercom, had told him he could bring one personal item. Everyone else, apparently, brought weapons. Dressen had a short ceramic blade that he kept on his person at all times, even while sleeping. Kale had brought the collected works of Marcus Aurelius. Dressen looked at the book, and then looked at Kale, and then looked at the book again. He didn't say anything, which Kale was beginning to understand was how Dressen expressed the full range of his opinions. "Where are we?" Kale asked. "Level 42. For now." Dressen leaned back against the wall. "First of the month they move you. Random assignment. Could go up, could go down. Don't get attached to the number. And the hole in the floor, the feed comes through it once a day, from the top." He paused. You'd better not be squeamish. He wasn't, or he hadn't been. By the end of the first week, he understood that squeamish was a category that had no meaning here. The feed came at 0900 precisely, a massive platform, 10 meters square, descending through the shaft on a system of hydraulic columns. It was loaded at level 1 by workers Kale had never seen and would never see, real food, apparently, prepared by actual chefs. Roasted proteins and fermented grains, and on the platform's far corner, a perfect little dessert. A single pale custard in a ceramic cup, always immaculate, always untouched. No one at level 1 ever ate it. Kale didn't understand why until Dressen explained. It's a message. The chefs send it down every day as a kind of signal. They think of it as proof that the system can work if everyone takes only what they need. He picked a piece of something unidentifiable from between his teeth. It never arrives intact. Usually gone by level 12. What happens to the lower levels? Dressen looked at him. What do you think happens? Kale had grown up on colony ships. He'd learned early that resources were finite and the people controlling them were not, as a rule, generous. But he'd also grown up in the Survey Corps, where a bad resupply decision on a deep-run mission could kill a 6-person crew, and so the ethic he had absorbed was different. You took your share, not more. You left the margins for the ones behind you. You did this because you might be the ones behind you next time. He thought this was obvious. He had thought it was obvious for his entire adult life. He was wrong, apparently. The Veth had designed the stratum. Kale learned this slowly, in pieces, the way you learn anything in a place where information is currency and everyone is broke. The Veth were one of 6 dominant species in the Coherence, the political body that administered the 300 habitable systems of the settled arm. They were tall, chitinous, communicated partly through chemical signals that humans couldn't read, and they had, over the course of 2 centuries, developed a theory of social optimization that they believed was mathematically perfect. The theory was called voluntary stratification. Its premise: if you place a population in a hierarchical resource system with random positional assignment, you can observe and measure the species' capacity for collective reasoning. The population that learns to self-regulate, to distribute resources voluntarily, to resist the individual benefit logic of the upper floors. That population is, by Veth metric, a civilization worth full Coherence membership. The ones who couldn't figure it out stayed in the stratum until they died or went mad. The Veth replenished the population from the criminal justice systems of member species. In human terms, the stratum was a prison. In Veth terms, it was a test. They had been running it for 40 years. They had never, not once, observed voluntary self-regulation beyond level 8. Dressen told him all of this on the third day in the same flat tone he used for everything. Kale listened without interrupting, which seemed to be what Dressen needed. He was the kind of man who had processed his rage a long time ago and now just needed somewhere to put the facts. They think it proves something about us, Dressen said. About humans specifically. We've been in the Coherence for 60 years. We're still provisional members. Still under behavioral review. He tapped the ceramic blade against his palm. The stratum is part of the review. And the other species. The Orth completed the test in 9 months. The Hessen in 14. Both are full members. He looked at the hole in the floor. We've been in here for 40 years and we still eat everything before it gets to level 20. Kale sat with that for a long time. He opened his book. Dressen watched him, that evaluating look still in place. What does it say? Dressen asked finally. Kale read aloud without looking up. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That's the most useless thing I've ever heard, Dressen said. Yeah, Kale said. I know. I keep reading it anyway. The month turned and they were moved. Level 12. Level 12 was different. At level 12, the feed arrived still full. Proteins heaped in their serving vessels, grains steaming, and the little custard in its cup sitting at the corner, still perfect. Kale and Dressen ate, and Kale watched the platform descend and thought about all the levels below. His new cellmate, Dressen had been reassigned elsewhere, was a woman named Eurus. She'd been in the stratum for 11 months. She'd been an administrator for a regional coherence office before she'd done something that the Veth judiciary had classified as an offense against collective optimization. She'd redistributed supplies from a Veth storage depot to a human colony station running on fumes. Unauthorized. Technically theft. She wasn't sorry. She still had the datapad she'd brought in as her personal item. It contained, she said, 11 months of observations, population estimates by level, consumption rates. The math of the thing, laid out plainly. If every person in the stratum ate a precise portion, 1/552nd of the total daily load, everyone would eat. Not well. Not comfortably. But enough to live. 552 people, she said. The stratum has 276 levels, 2 per level. She showed him the numbers. The feed is calibrated exactly for this. The chefs know. The Veth know if we just... She stopped. But we don't. What happens when you try to explain the math to people? I've tried it on 3 different levels. She put the datapad down. Level 67, they listened and then ate everything anyway. Level 104, the man on the other cot broke my arm. Level 29, a woman cried and then told me she was going to take extra just in case she ended up lower next month. Kale thought about this. She wasn't wrong, he said. From an individual optimization standpoint, I know she wasn't wrong. Eurus's voice was tired. That's the problem. Every individual decision is rational. The collective outcome is catastrophic. And the Veth sit up there. She pointed at the ceiling and watch and take notes and conclude that humans are incapable of civilization. She rubbed her eyes. We're not incapable. We're just, the incentives are wrong. You can't ask someone who might be at level 200 next month to leave food for someone they've never met. Unless they know they might be that someone, Kale said. She looked at him. What? Unless the person on level 12 today has already been on level 200, has already been the person starving. He thought about the month on level 42, the way the feed had arrived, scraped and smeared and barely adequate even there. The Veth designed this to test whether we'd learn. They rotate us randomly, so theoretically every person has been at the bottom, has felt it, and they still take everything because they're afraid. He looked at the hole in the floor. Fear makes people narrow, makes them optimize for now instead of for next month. You can't reason with fear, you have to. He stopped. What? You have to go down, he said quietly. Someone has to ride the platform down, not just talk about rationing, actually enforce it. Level by level. Eurus was quiet for a long time. That's suicide, she said. People on the lower levels are desperate. They'll kill you for a scrap. Maybe. He picked up his book. But the alternative is that we fail the test. 40 years in and we fail. And the Veth have their data and they reclassify humans as. He'd heard the Veth term. He didn't know its exact translation, but Dressen had rendered it into something like perpetual juveniles. Species kept in the coherence as protected populations, but never granted full membership, never given a seat at the table where the decisions that shaped the settled arm were made. He thought about colony ships, about the Survey Corps, about the 6-person crews that had been disappearing into deep runs for 60 years. Mapping systems the Veth cataloged and owned, and used to fuel expansion that humans had no vote in. He thought about the custard that never arrived. "Tell me about the lower levels," he said. "Everything you know." It took him 3 more months to find Voss. He'd been moved to level 91, then level 38, then up to level 9, which felt like luck until he realized it wasn't luck. It was the Veth's random number generator, and it would eventually average out, and he would spend time at the bottom regardless. He used the high levels to study, to talk, to map what he could of the social dynamics. At level 9, he could hear, faintly through the shaft, the sounds of the levels below. Voices, sometimes screaming, always the mechanical descent of the feed at 0900. Voss was on level 38 when KL had been there, but they'd been in different cells and only passed in the corridor twice. The second time, Voss had stopped and looked at him and said, "You're the one who's been talking to people, am I?" Word travels in the shaft. Sound carries. Voss was a big man, former freight handler on a jump gate station, currently in the stratum for having punched a Veth compliance officer. He said this without apology. "People say you're trying to organize something, a dissent. People exaggerate. Are they?" Kale had looked at him for a long moment. Voss had the eyes of someone who had thought about this, had thought hard, and arrived somewhere past the obvious objections and was now waiting for someone else to catch up. "No," Kale said. "They're not." They found each other again on level 44, 7 months later. Coincidence, or the Stratum's version of it, which was not coincidence at all, but the law of large numbers working slowly. By then, KL had found 4 other people willing to try. Not willing to believe it would work. Not willing to believe they would survive. Just willing to try. They had in common a specific gravity, the kind you develop when you've been at the bottom and you know, in your body, what it costs. And a specific stubbornness that the Veth, he suspected, had not adequately modeled. The Veth were meticulous. They were ancient and sophisticated, and they understood mathematics better than any species in the settled arm. But they had, Keiko had come to believe, a blind spot. They modeled species behavior based on individual incentive structures. They understood fear and self-interest and status competition with great precision. They did not model, he wasn't sure they could model, the specific thing that made a person ride a platform into the dark for someone they'd never met. Not duty, not ideology. Something older than both. The thing that made a species leave their marks on cave walls, build ships to carry their dead, hum songs their mothers taught them, while doing the worst work imaginable. He didn't have a name for it. He'd read the Stoics and they came close, but not quite. He'd thought about it on every level. Watching people eat and hoard and fight, watching the feed arrive and depart, and watching people choose now, over then, me over us. And somewhere in the middle of all that watching, he had arrived at the conclusion that the Veth were wrong. Not about humans, about the test. The Veth were testing whether humans would self-regulate under fear. You couldn't, nobody could. Fear closed everything down, narrowed the aperture until only the immediate was visible. What you could do, what humans specifically could do in Kale's empirical sample of 11 months and 40-some levels, was act, despite fear. Not without it, through it. You could be afraid of the descent and choose it anyway. You could know the math and know it didn't favor you and step onto the platform regardless. Because there was something down there that mattered more than the math. The Veth didn't model that variable. He was going to make them account for it. They called it the descent, which was accurate if unimaginative. Kale, Voss, Iris, and 2 others, a former surveyor named Pell and a medic named Chandra who had been in the stratum longer than any of them and was somehow still gentle, stepped onto the feed platform at 0900 on the 1st of the month and wrote it down from level 33. The plan was simple and brutal. They would ride the platform, and at each level they would ensure that no one took more than their portion. If people cooperated, they moved on. If people didn't cooperate, they enforced. The word enforced had generated a long argument. Uris had wanted to use persuasion only. Voss had said persuasion was a luxury of the upper levels. Kale had said they would try persuasion first and move to force only if necessary, and that he would carry that weight personally, and would not ask anyone else to. He carried it by level 38. A man on 38 was 3 months from the bottom. Had been. Knew it in his face, the hollowed quality of it. The way his eyes went to the food before anything else. He'd been hoarding, had half the platform's protein load stacked behind his cot in a way that would leave the next 40 levels without. Kale had tried to talk to him. Voss had tried. The man had come at KL with a length of pipe, ripped from the water system, and KL had taken the first hit across the shoulder and put him down on the second exchange, and the food had gone back to the platform, and the platform had descended. Afterward, KL had sat at the edge of the level's floor hole and watched the platform drop away. His shoulder was going to be interesting tomorrow. Voss sat down next to him, didn't say anything, just sat. After a while, KL said he's going to be angrier when he wakes up. Yeah, we might see him again. At a lower level. Yeah, I don't know if this is working. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, before I hit the compliance officer, before I ended up here, he pulled at a thread on his sleeve. I was on a gate station for 11 years, me and 30 other handlers, running cargo through the Ostenvar jump. Dangerous work. One of us died every 18 months or so, on average, equipment failure. Bad luck, the usual. And every time someone died, the Veth oversight manager would write up a report about individual liability and optimize the shift schedules, and nothing ever changed. He paused. The 30 of us, we had a thing we did. After someone died, we'd take a shift off, unauthorized, the whole crew, and we'd go to the commissary and we'd eat together. Every person. All of us. Equal portions. Even if someone wasn't hungry, even if someone hated someone else, we'd sit there and eat, and nobody talked much, but nobody left either. He looked at the whole. Took 6 hours. Veth manager lost his mind. But none of us died the next year. People looked out for each other differently after. Started noticing things. Started saying something when the conditions were wrong. He rubbed his face. I don't know how to put that in math, but it worked. Kale thought about that. About the specificity of it. 30 people in a commissary, equal portions, 6 hours of not leaving. I know what you mean, he said. They descended. Below level 100, the food was mostly gone. They had managed to preserve portions at the levels they'd passed through, but the math was remorseless. The platform started with enough for everyone, but the slippage at every level where they hadn't been able to enforce, the gorging at the upper floors in the weeks before the descent, had compounded. By level 110, they were distributing handfuls. By 130, Chandra was making medical decisions about who was worst off, and in most need of what little remained. Pell had been injured on level 122. Not badly, but enough that she moved slower, and the platform stopped for exactly the same time at every level, and slower meant sometimes they were still distributing when the hydraulics kicked back in and the platform began to drop. At level 158, a woman grabbed Kale's arm as the platform started moving. She wasn't trying to attack him. She was trying to show him something on the level below. A man lying prone who wasn't moving. She was crying, but silently. The way people cry when they've been doing it for a long time and aren't sure anymore that the sound serves any purpose. Kael looked at the man. Looked at the woman. The platform was descending. He made a decision that Eurus later told him was insane, which was probably fair. He jumped. The drop was 3 meters. He hit the lower level hard, rolled, came up on one knee. The man was alive, had been unconscious, dehydrated, whatever. Kale had 2 emergency ration packets that Chandra had entrusted to him for exactly this kind of case. He cracked both and got the man sitting up and drinking. The platform was 1 level below him now. 1 level below that, Voss's voice calling up. Kale looked around the cell. Gray walls, gray floor, the hole above where he'd come from. The hole below where he'd need to go. The man he'd helped was watching him with an expression that was half suspicion, half something Kale didn't have a name for. Like he'd seen something move against the current and couldn't quite explain it. There's more food coming, Kale told him. Not today. But if this works, tomorrow. Next week. You understand? The man said nothing. You're going to wake up and it's going to seem like nothing changed. And the feed is going to come and it's going to be sparse, like it always was. And the person next to you is going to eat too much. He stood up. Leave something anyway. Leave something and tell the next level to do the same. He jumped through the floor hole and dropped to the platform below. Level 260. They were 5 people on the platform, with a handful of provisions, and 260 levels of the shaft above them, and what felt, in the body, like the entire weight of the coherence looking down. Chandra was performing rough calculations on a scrap of material she'd been using for the last week. 19 more levels, she said. That's how many people we can still adequately nourish with what we have left. And after that? After that, we're symbolic. Eurus, who had not slept in what felt like days, said symbols matter. Nobody argued with her. They were, all 5 of them, well past arguing. They had reached the place on the far side of fear where the only thing left is the thing you're doing and the doing of it. At level 268, they found something none of them had expected, a child. She was maybe 7 years old, human, curled in the corner of a cell that had no second occupant. She was alive, barely. The state of her suggested she'd been there a long time, surviving on the margin of the feed's leavings at a level deep enough that even scraps rarely reached. She had dark eyes that tracked them carefully when they came onto her level, without fear, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one. Kale had been carrying in his interior pocket one item that had made it through 268 levels intact, the custard. The little ceramic cup from the far corner of the platform, the one the chefs sent down every day as their message, the one that never arrived. He'd taken it from level 1 on the day they'd started, had decided that if anything was going to arrive at the bottom of the stratum, it was going to be the thing that was supposed to. He set it in front of her. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "You're supposed to eat it," he said. She ate it. There was a silence in the group, a quality of silence he didn't have good language for. Not relief, exactly, not triumph. More like the moment at the end of a long piece of music when the final note resolves, and for one breath you don't move, because the movement would break something. Voss had his eyes closed. Pell was looking at the ceiling. Eurus was making notes on her datapad, which was perhaps the most Eurus thing she had ever done, and somehow it made Kale's chest ache. He picked up the empty cup. The message went up through channels that Kale had not known existed. The stratum had an oversight board, apparently, a coherence committee that monitored the behavioral data and produced quarterly reports for the full coherence Senate. Eurus had known this. She had known, and had said nothing until they were back at the top. Because she was the kind of person who understood that you don't tell a man how steep the climb is until he's already started it. The report was unusual. 5 humans had descended the full length of the stratum. They had enforced partial rationing on over 200 levels. They had arrived at the lowest occupied level with sufficient provisions to feed 3 people. A small number, a number that did not approach the standard required for the voluntary stratification metric to register as a pass. The coherent Senate took it under advisement. The Veth advisory block argued that partial success was not success, that the metric existed for a reason, that 60 years of human provisional status was evidence of a pattern, not an anomaly. The argument went on for 3 weeks. Kale spent those 3 weeks in a debriefing facility at the Coherence Outpost on Meridian Station, eating regular food for the first time in 14 months, and sleeping in a room with soft lighting, and trying not to jump every time a door slid open. Voss was 3 rooms down. They played cards most evenings. Voss won most of the time, which Kale suspected was not unrelated to the years spent reading people on a jump gate station. Nikris was in the coherence hearings every day presenting data. She had 11 months of observations, plus the notes from the descent, a complete record of the behavioral pattern from every level they'd passed through. Not just what people had done, but what they'd said. How long it took for the math to penetrate fear. How the variables shifted when someone at a lower level discovered someone from above had voluntarily left something for them. She was meticulous. She was also, Kale had by now come to understand, the angriest person he had ever met, in the specific way that angry people are who never raise their voice. He went to one of the hearings, watched through the observer gallery. The Veth senators, 6 of them, their chitinous bodies moving with small precise shifts as they communicated in the chemical social layer that humans couldn't perceive, watched Eurus present, watched the data, asked questions that Kyle could hear through the translation earpiece but not fully parse, because the questions were structured around the Veth concept of collective optimization in a way that didn't map cleanly to human cognition. Then one of them, the senior delegate, the one who had spoken longest against human membership, asked a question that the translator rendered as, if your group had known at the beginning that the provisions were insufficient to feed the lowest levels, would you still have descended? Eurus looked at the question for a moment. Then she looked at Kale's section of the gallery, found him somehow through the observer glass. She turned back to the Senate. Yes, she said, we would have. The delegate's antennae moved in a pattern the translator flagged as inquiry unresolved. Why? It asked. And Eurus said something that Kale had not prepared her for, had not discussed with her, did not know she was going to say. Said it in the flat, precise voice she used for data, because the ones at the bottom were already there. They'd already been waiting. The least we could do was make sure they didn't wait alone. The full coherent Senate voted 8 days later. The result was not a pass of the voluntary stratification metric. The Veth were correct that partial success was not success by their metric's definition, and Kale had known this, and so had Eurus, and so had all of them. They had descended knowing that the math didn't work out. They had done it anyway. The result was something the Senate called a precedent exception, which their human liaison translated as a demonstration of a capacity not previously observed or modeled, which the standard metric was not designed to capture, which meant the test was wrong, not the humans, the test. The motion to upgrade human status from provisional to full coherence membership passed 7-3. The 3 dissenting votes were all Veth. The senior delegate abstained, which the liaison said was, in Veth social signaling, roughly equivalent to a concession. Kale heard this in his room on Meridian Station at 0700, 3 days before he was scheduled to leave for the Survey Corps' reintegration facility on Callus Prime. He sat with it for a while. Outside the window, a real window, the first he'd had in 14 months, the station's outer ring drifted past in the long, slow rotation that kept the gravity comfortable. He thought about the woman on level 158, crying silently, the man he'd left his ration packets with, the child eating the custard. He thought about Dressen, who had not been part of the descent, who had been reassigned somewhere in the stratum's lower thirds by the time Kael had started organizing. He didn't know where Dressen was, would probably never know. That specific incomplete knowledge felt like it needed to be carried, not solved, just carried. He opened his book, found the page he'd been reading since level 42. Dog-eared and slightly damp at the corners from 14 months of pockets and humidity, and the kind of handling that happens when you read something 100 times trying to get at what it actually means. Do not indulge in such thoughts as, what an important person I am, or what a significant thing I have done. Look at the mountains and rivers. Look at the plants. Look at the stars. What do all these ask of you? Nothing. What do they offer? Everything. Remember that you are made of the same matter as the stars, and that matter has been rearranged once before into the thing you are. It can be rearranged again. He closed the book. He looked at the stars through the window. What the Veth had not modeled, what he wasn't sure could be modeled, was that humans had a very specific relationship to futility. They had been built by 100,000 years of small groups in difficult environments, and what that history had selected for was not the ability to win, but the ability to act when winning was uncertain, to descend anyway, to leave something on the platform anyway, to sit in a commissary after a death and eat equal portions in silence and stay, because staying mattered, because presence was its own kind of message. The Veth were optimizers. They saw the stratum and saw a test with a past condition. They had not imagined that the species failing the test might one day demonstrate that the test itself was what needed to change. That was perhaps the most human thing of all. Not the winning, the insistence on reframing. Outside, the stars didn't ask anything of him. They offered everything. He watched them until the rotation carried them away, and then he packed his bag, and the book went on top, and he zipped it closed, and he went to find Voss to tell him the news. The door slid open, and Voss was already in the corridor, holding 2 cups of the worst coffee available on Meridian Station, which was the only kind either of them had access to. He handed one to Kale without saying anything. They drank it standing in the corridor, which was exactly the right way to drink bad coffee after winning something that had never been supposed to be winnable. And then they walked toward the transport bay together, and neither of them looked back.